Hey, good people. Grits or cream of wheat? Who the hell is racist? Does anyone ever ask if they touch your hair?
Black Like Me.
You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G., a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Here's Dr. G.
Black Like Me.
Hey, everyone. I want to welcome you back to another exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. And you know, I just keep finding interesting people to talk to. We continue to have these great conversations, and we just keep trudging away at figuring out how to address issues of race, racial disparity, gaps in how we interact with each other. And I just keep finding examples of things that people are doing that really help to move us in the right direction. Before I get into our show today, just want to give a shout out to all the folks who continue to listen, continue to share this podcast. I'm still walking up to complete strangers, or perhaps I should say they walk up to me and tell me about episodes that they've been listening to. So thank you for that. We're continuing to watch people from as far away as Namibia and Africa. The UK continues to grow in its listenership, and we're finding that more and more people in Asia are listening, in Japan and in China and Vietnam. So I am extremely glad that this message and my voice is going around the world. That's so exciting. And so I just want you all to know that I appreciate that. I'm really intrigued by the fact that universities and seminaries are starting to conduct something that's called a slave audit. Universities like Brown and Georgetown and seminaries like Southern in Louisville or Princeton Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey are starting to really look at the impact of slavery, slave labor, and even dollars from slavery that has helped to establish and grow their seminaries. It's very intriguing to me. I think current political conditions, I think a better understanding of the reality of systemic racism as a result of not only slavery, but a mindset of American exceptionalism, where white people of faith had the right to take people's land, genocide, slavery, etc. These institutions of higher learning are putting faculty time and resources into the studies in order to show its impact upon their institutions and higher learning. I think it's going to have a tremendous ripple effect, some good, some bad, but I'm just very intrigued by the discussions. I spoke recently with a friend of mine, Craig Barnes, who's the president of Princeton Theological Seminary, and he said that they have a two-pronged approach to their findings. The report itself is merely a confession, but now the board must take up what it does in response to those findings. And that's very intriguing to me because I live in a very academic community where studies are celebrated because it shows headiness, but they are often and quickly shelved with very few dollars put into their implementation. So we fund studies, we make room for studies, but we don't really think about what the next step is. And so Princeton Seminary is using a theological framework that says we confess in order to change. And so what the board is taking up is what steps will it take to change, whether they use the wording of reparations, which he doesn't back away from, because he says it means to repair people, which is a biblical concept as well. So it's just very, very interesting. And so as you listen to this upcoming interview with Dr. M. Craig Barnes, president of Princeton Theological Seminary, think about the institutions that you're a part of, institutions of higher learning from which you've matriculated, neighborhoods where you live, cities where you live, and just ask yourself, what impact has slave or slave ownership had on my life? How have I unwittingly participated in this system? How have I benefited from this system? Because if Princeton and others follow their convictions and they listen to the people that are making recommendations for restitution or reparations, it means a huge shift to how people do business. And I think it's an important concept. So listen to this interview. You're going to find it very intriguing. Share it with friends, process it, and keep the dialogue going. Today, I have a real distinguished guest. His name is Craig Barnes. He's the current president of Princeton Theological Seminary, and we go way, way back. He used to pastor here in Madison, Wisconsin. And so, Dr. Craig Barnes, I'm so glad to be able to talk with you. Welcome to Black Like Me.
Thanks, Alex. It's good to be in conversation with you again.
Oh, man, it sure is. I enjoyed being out at the seminary several weeks ago. I was invited to come and speak with African-American seminarians. I think the topic was things I wish I knew about, things I wish I knew before finishing seminary, and I had a fabulous time, and it was great to be able to sit down and have a meal with you. It's been way too long since we've been able to sit down and catch up. So just know that I appreciated being on your campus, and I really enjoyed having time with you.
Well, our students are still talking about your insights that you left behind, so it's a gift that keeps giving us.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And so let me just brag on my friend Craig for just a bit. As I mentioned, he's a pastor. He studied at King's College. He studied at Princeton Seminary and at the University of Chicago. He took a pastorate here in Madison where we connected. And we'll get into this as he comes on. But he actually was one of the first people that I sat down with and shared my idea about Nehemiah, the Center for Urban Leadership Development. That was over 30 years ago. The organization is 27 years, but he's one of the first friends I shared the concept with, and actually sat with me and introduced me to his peers here in Madison. Many of whom became founding partners and contributors to this work. He's a noted author. He's written books like Yearning, When God Interrupts, Searching for Home, The Pastor's Minor Prophet, Hustling God, Sacred Thirst, Body and Soul. He's a reputable and respected theologian, preacher extraordinaire, but most importantly, he's a friend of mine and someone who I used to meet with on a weekly basis on Thursdays. If any of you are familiar with the Madison area, there used to be a restaurant called Ovens of Brittany, and we used to meet at the University Avenue Ovens of Brittany on Thursday for years. Hey, I wanted to go down just memory lane for just a little bit. You and I met in, was it probably the late 80s, maybe around 89, or was it 90? We connected.
It was late 80s. Yeah,
late 80s.
I don't remember the exact time.
Sure. But it was late 80s, and a mutual friend introduced us. And I think we had a dinner together. Our mutual friend Norma introduced us, and somehow out of that meal, you reached out and said, "Hey, let's get together. Let's talk. Let's pray. Let's just connect and see what's happening in each of our lives." And who would have known that 30 plus years ago we'd still be talking? But I really appreciate you reaching out to me. That was the first pastoral colleague that ever reached out to me and said, let's get together on a consistent basis, on a weekly basis, and just talk, check in with each other, and pray. And I want you to know, Craig, that during those times that was a real highlight of my week.
Well, we were both relatively new in our pastoral ministries at that time, and
Right.
I needed help. I needed to be talking to another pastor, and I needed someone who was able to help me see a bigger picture of Jesus than I had on my own, and I really appreciated the use agreeing to get together, and we quickly became close friends.
Right. You know what's interesting about that experience is we decided to go a little deeper. So actually, I'm trying to think, Craig, did that precipitate? It must have the meetings or the prayer gatherings between our congregations, because in addition to you and I meeting, I remember there being a period of time where we'd have a prayer gathering at Fountain of Life. It was Union Tabernacle back in those days. Most people don't know anything about that, but we were UT or Union Tabernacle. And then we go and meet in the Lake Room at Christ Press. So not only were you and I meeting, but we were really bringing some stakeholders and influencers in both of our congregations, and they got to know each other as well. And I think that's a step that I rarely see now as churches try to move into cross-cultural relationships. They typically limit it to just pulpit exchange. But am I remembering that correctly? Folks from our congregations were meeting together in addition to you and I having our one-on-one meetings.
Yeah, as I remember it, as you and I met together and became closer friends, we began to develop a kind of a dream of how we could help our congregations have a similar experience. And then, so the next stage was those prayer meetings that sometimes met at your church and sometimes met at our church with our leaders.
Yes.
And that was a hoot, because you're a Kojic church, so and we're Presbyterians, so we had a bunch of black Pentecostals and white Presbyterians trying to pray together.
We were trying to meet in the middle.
Yeah, well, we heated up as high as we could go, and you guys toned it down a little, and we found the middle place. It was great.
I as I mentioned in the introduction, there are so many folks who are non-African American who who are subscribers to Black Like Me because they really want to develop a fuller understanding of race and race relations. And we were both new to this, Craig, so there was not like a script that we were following. But it's amazing to me that that people who were in that room, some of whom are deceased and no longer with us, but became mentors. Like Pete Hammond was a part of that group. And when he passed away, I was actually recruiting him to the Nehemiah board. But he had been a mentor to me. I spoke at I eulogized him and his wife, Shirley. But I met them as like a 20-something young pastor in those prayer meetings. And decades later, we were still friends. I'm still friends with Doug and Norma. I don't see them nearly enough. And so it's amazing to me that we laid a foundation that allowed people to still be able to communicate, but, beyond just a pulpit exchange.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that was kind of the third stage, wasn't it? I mean,
it was.
Started with our friendship, and then we extended that to the prayer meetings.
Right.
And then out of the prayer meetings, the group began to dream together.
Right.
And so that led to service and mission together. And by then you were developing the Nehemiah Corporation. And
right.
so we were able to serve that. And I think the missional component of it was what really tied the churches firmly together.
Definitely. And that relationship really flowed somewhat effortlessly. It didn't mean that we didn't have differing approaches to things, but I just have noticed that since then there's been almost a microwave approach to trying to build cross-cultural relationships, and so we eventually evolved into worship experience together. But I'm seeing people really start from that perspective and not really build any trust or rapport among each other. So I'm just reflecting back. I'm just really grateful that we went through that process. We went to a conference together. It was a SCOOP conference, and that's an acronym for Seminary Consortium on Urban Pastoral Education. And your congregation invited some of our leaders, and I saw things there like faith-based leaders who are starting daycares, after-school programs, senior care, health clinics, and it blew me away. And I came back from that. I'm sort of speeding the story up, but eventually left my job at the University of Wisconsin-Madison because when you and I met, I think I was still bivocational. And I was bivocational until 92. And I was so stirred by some of those speakers, Brenda Salter McNeil, Bob Lupton, Ray Bakke, and Wayne Gordon, John Perkins, that it really shifted my thinking, that I wanted to take my work outside the walls. And it's amazing to think that Nehemiah is almost 30 years old, and we've become somewhat of a mainstay in our community, and particularly in the area of reentry housing, youth leadership development, and still convening people to do great work. We're on the front lines of still trying to bring about racial justice and racial harmony. We just took our 900th non-Black participant through our U.S. Black History course. And so I'm sharing all of this with you, Craig, because sometimes we just need to realize that we do certain things just effortlessly because we're asked to. And I asked you to introduce me to some of the downtown clergy, more established clergy who I didn't know. And it's just good for me to share with you that almost 30 years later, that work and that fruit is still really happening here in the community, and the community is still benefiting from it. So I just want to thank you again for that friendship. And I miss those Thursdays.
Well, it was wonderful to be a part of something that was growing organically and was growing through relationships.
Yes,
and growing through kind of the mutual discovery of a dream.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember introducing you to some of the other mainline Protestant pastors.
Right.
Some of them were really excited about the dream and encouraging and wanted to know how they could participate. But I remember one pastor who said, that'll never work.
He sure did.
He's gone, and you're still there.
We're still there. He said that right to my face. He didn't wait to go home to say it. He didn't write it in a note. He just said it right there. That was before the internet, or the public internet, so he didn't even tweet it out. Excuse me. Craig, I remember another, just one more reflection before we get into some of the other things I'd love to talk with you about. But I remember when we first started connecting, you said, hey, Alex, we want to really partner with you, but we're just really afraid that as white people, we might just take over And I remember saying, well, Craig, I'm not sure what kind of black people you've been you've been working with, but the black people I roll with, they're not going to let anything be taken from them. I remember us both laughing. I remember us both laughing about it. Was very helpful to me because up until that point, I did not realize the hesitation on the part of some white partners in working cross-culturally, because there was a fear of, getting in and changing things and taking them over. And I think many times in my community that have been read or misread as apathy. People aren't getting involved because they don't care. You and your leaders cared, but there was some real concern that you honestly voiced that we don't want to mess the relationship up. We don't want money to mess it up. We don't want that to be tied to power. We don't want to try to take over. And I understand now looking back, we had a relationship. We were praying together. We were connecting together. And there was a concern that money and power might mess that relationship up. And you articulated that. And I think because that's not often acknowledged in partnerships, I think what you feared has happened around the country and around the world. But because you and I had that honest conversation, I was able to avoid those pitfalls when that may have been the case in other potential partnerships. So I don't know if you remember voicing that, but I clearly remember not only that you voiced it, but that I took heed and watched and made sure that I would learn from that and be really clear as I moved ahead with other partners that the expectation was we're partners, but money or exchange of resources does not make one a smaller sibling or an older sibling in the partnership.
Well, I think there's some awkwardness on the part of well-meaning, predominantly white churches who enter into these partnerships, right. and for good reason. I mean, that's been our history to utilize money and power in a way that is not just. And so, knowing that that's been our history in this country, we really want to do this, but how do we do it right? How do we do it in a way that's equitable and just? And how do we come to a table with you where everybody is equally valued and we're all bringing different resources, and you have resources that our church didn't have that we needed in order to fulfill our mission in the city. And you had expertise, you had insights, there was a part of the kingdom that you knew much better than we did, and so all of that had to be expressed and just kind of put on the table. And I think it was a relationship, and it was done in the context of prayerfulness, and it's hard to lie in prayer. Sure. So we just had to tell the truth about that, as clumsy as it was.
Yeah, those are very good memories, and so I'm just glad that the fruit continues. And so after we got Nehemiah established, not long after, you had a call to Washington, D.C., where you did a stint, and then you were in you had a very, very large church, National Press Church, and then you were in Pittsburgh, where you worked for a seminary, I believe, and still worked for a local congregation. And then since 2013, I believe, you've been at Princeton as the president since 2013, you've been at Princeton as the president of the seminary. Do I have my dates right? Was that 2013?
Yes. Yeah, I started January 2013, a little over 6 years ago.
Sure. So that's got to be great to come back to your alma mater. I think you served on Princeton's board for a number of years, but that's got to be a great coup for Princeton to have one of its alums to come back and be at the helm. So I know they're glad about that, and you certainly look like you're enjoying it. You look great in your context. I enjoyed seeing that. I heard some discussion while I was at the seminary that really intrigued me, and I think when you and I were having dinner, I said, Craig, I would love to talk with you more about this. Now I know that there's an official title, but I couldn't write fast enough. But I know that it's around the campus is referred to a slavery audit. But there's an audit that's taken place at Princeton Seminary to just look at some of the influence of slavery, slave labor, or to see if there is any slavery or slave labor connected to the building and establishment of Princeton Seminary. But please remind me what the full name of the study is, because I want to make sure I get that out there.
It's called the Historical Audit on Slavery and Princeton Seminary.
Okay, right. So Princeton started, 1812, almost 200 years before you became president, and then there's this historical look at Princeton's beginnings, I'm intrigued. So I have so many questions, but just tell me from your perspective, how did the audit come about? What precipitated it? Was it your new leadership? Was it faculty? Was it students? How did the audit come about? Because I just think that's very intriguing.
Well, it had a number of origins. It had a number of origins. Student activism, I would say, was certainly part of it. Mm-hmm. I started having conversations with our students, particularly in 2014, which, as you know, was a really rough year.
Yes.
After the shootings at Michael Brown in Ferguson and Eric Gardner in New York, and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter initiative,
sure.
And all campuses were engaged in really significant, in-depth conversations and protests and demonstrations about race, including ours. So in conversations with the students were calling for it. Can we get to kind of some sense of what our seminary's own relationship with slavery was? About the same time, some of our professors had brought to me a audit that Brown University had done, and that I think that was one of the first ones that was done, and it was kind of the gold standard. Theirs
Sure.
came out in 2007. Their president, Ruth Simmons, called for it, who was the first African American president of Brown, and so they looked into their school's history with slavery and then developed some recommendations. And then a third source of its origin was at the university, Princeton University, which is a block away from us, had launched an audit of their relationship with slavery. And our seminary came out of Princeton University. It used to be called the College of New Jersey before it became Princeton. And the College of New Jersey's mission was to train Presbyterian pastors. But they began to discover that they needed to give these students a undergraduate liberal arts education before they started teaching them theology. So some of the professors came over across the street here to start the seminary in 1812. But we had similar origins, or the same origin, I should say.
Sure.
But we had the same origin. So if whatever the university found about their beginnings with slavery was going to impact our story as well.
Of course.
So since they had launched theirs audit of slavery, we really felt like we needed to do the same thing to tell the truth about our story with this.
Wow. And was it I know you can't get into all the details of this, but was it more difficult to get the trustees on board than it was faculty? Because this just seems like a huge undertaking, because so often people don't want to talk about this because it's so ugly. I mean, as a person who's studying his own genealogy, some of my white relatives who I've met have been ostracized for telling some of the family secrets about the black G and the white G origins, and so I know it brings up stuff. So I'm just curious. Was it more difficult to get the trustees on board or faculty for this audit?
There are a number of schools, actually many schools, that are conducting these audits now. And as we looked at how other schools are doing it, there's really kind of two ways of doing it. There's kind of a top-down approach that the administration or the board calls for it, like what happened at Brown. And then they pull together a team of people to conduct the research. And then there's the ground-up approach, whether it's student-led or at the university it was faculty-led program, and then the administration and board is put in a reactive mode. And we didn't want to go with either of those approaches. We're a small school, so we wanted to have a community approach where we were all working on this at the same time, and we're small enough that we can do that. So I brought the idea to the board. The students brought ideas to me. The faculty were the ones who actually conducted the audit, and it was a 2-year research.
Wow, 2 years.
Yeah, two years of hard research to get to the truth of exactly what our relationship to slavery was. And some grad students were involved in the development, particularly the economic analysis of the relationship, which was quite complicated. Then we released the audit findings first to the board. And usually when these audits are released, there's a set of recommendations or sometimes call for reparations that are attached to them.
Sure.
So the board received the audit. It's about 110 pages of documents.
Wow.
And narrative. Most of it's narrative, but also just some about half of it's appendices of economic analysis in particular. The board received the report, but they encouraged us to not get to the recommendations just yet, but to have a year of conversation on campus about what the recommendations should be that we would make to the board. So in October of last fall, we had a public release of the slavery audit. We spent all afternoon in conversation about it. The committee that wrote the report had a panel discussion on it. We brought down Willie Jennings, a leading African-American scholar from Yale Divinity School, to provide an outside perspective on it.
Sure.
The board was at that meeting. They had another meeting of their own because they had all read Edward Baptist's book, The Half That's Never Been Told, which, again, provides economic analysis of just how much of the national economy was driven by slavery.
Definitely.
And then we've had about a dozen events on campus since last October, which are slavery audit related. Sometimes it's been town hall meetings. Sometimes it's been bringing in speakers. James Forbes, remember he was at that Scoop conference.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, he's come to talk to us about it. We've done other panel discussions. We've had conversations with the faculty at some length, even here in my home, to think through how does this affect how we teach. And all along, we've had a task force that's been collecting responses to the audit, suggestions to turn into recommendations. They're now wrapping up their work, and they'll be presenting a slate of about 20 to 25 recommendations to our board next month. And these recommendations will entail like changes that should be made to the curriculum, and changes that should be made to financial packages for students, and changes that should be made to what we call signs and symbols on campus, naming of putting other people's names on buildings. But it isn't just symbolic issues like plaques and names on buildings. There's a lot of substance in terms of what we need to do to help repair our relationship with the African American students and community here in Princeton.
Wow, that's a deep dive. To your knowledge, is Princeton first or one of the first seminaries to conduct such an audit? Because you mentioned Brown and other places. Like I know Georgetown's been in the news recently, but those aren't seminaries. I'm curious, is Princeton somewhat of a leader in doing this from as a seminary?
I read something about Southern Seminary in Louisville doing something similar. I don't know.
Okay.
If they have a set of recommendations for change, but that's really important part of this, I think, because the audit is really just confession. It's just telling the truth. Sure. It's the recommendations or the reparations where you get to repentance, and the
that's a powerful distinction, Craig, because we don't necessarily hear those two. That's a very powerful distinction. You said the audit is the confession.
Yeah, the audit is essentially confessing and telling the truth about our history with slavery, and that's a good and important thing. And we've been confessing this more deeply all year as we've gotten deeper and deeper into the implications of this, because it's not just what did happen, but it's the legacy of it. It's how does this continue to happen? How do we have this same kind of orientation that our founders had that was so unhelpful? And complicit in a slave economy. How are we still doing this? So the confessing has been going on all along. That's one thing. But the purpose of confession is to repent, to turn, to make changes. Right. So the recommendations to the board for repentance is the part that we're now getting to, and that's going to be thick and costly.
Yeah. Wow. So tell me, when you read the audit in terms of Princeton's history, what were there statements from founders? Like, what were some of the things that were just quite surprising to you, surprising or disturbing to you? Was it the amount of money? Was it the use of slave labor? Do you remember what really jumped out at you initially as a finding of something that you probably didn't know?
It was kind of a mixed story. We didn't use slave labor for the building of the buildings, but about 15% of our total revenue in 1860 came from slave owners. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, as you get deeper into this, you realize that 100% of the money that the seminary had at that time had some tie to slavery.
Sure. That's what I was just thinking.
At one end, there's the slave owners, but on the other hand, there's those who ran businesses like trains and shipping that were benefited by slavery, even though they didn't own slaves themselves. And at the other end, there was those who really didn't have much to do with slavery, but if you bought a cotton shirt in 1860, you were still a part of the system.
You were still a part of it. Yeah, it's interesting, Craig. We run a U.S. Black History course for non-Black allies, and one of the things that we want to do, and we use faculty, really key faculty from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and because there's an interest in wanting to know, how do we really live out our progressive nature in Madison? How do we live into our state motto of forward? And so I had this idea of bringing people up to the present by understanding how we got here, and it had been difficult up until that point to help to explain sort of the residual effects of slavery. And you mentioned it, like if you bought a cotton shirt during that time, or the rail expanded, or shipping yards expanded because of slavery and slave labor, that it really created a system that even if people did not buy or hold or have ever purchased slaves, they bought into the economy that promoted it. And so that's a difficult concept, isn't it, for people to grasp that there was slavery, the business of slavery, but then a system that was created because of that. And that's been a great aha here. But that's a difficult concept for folks to understand who have more of an individualistic approach or ideology about life and social settings.
Right. There's an assumption that if you were above the Mason-Dixon line, this isn't your story. You don't have to deal with this.
Exactly.
And that's just not at all true.
Right.
So much of the economy was driven on the backs of slaves. So that was part of the legacy of this that concerned me. Another part of it was our founders had kind of what we say in the report, a lack of theological imagination. Some of them had at one point had slaves, but by the time they were here, they didn't. They thought slavery was wrong, but they wouldn't argue biblically against it. In fact, they said there were some biblical arguments supporting slavery or allowing slavery. But they thought we would outgrow slavery. And so that's a part of the legacy issue.
Sure.
They were very concerned about abolitionists because they thought that was a radical response to slavery that would dismantle the country. And so they had kind of a commitment to gradualism and so part of what the audit reveals is when it comes to something that you think is wrong, you don't wait to outgrow it. Gradualism is not a good response to injustice.
Cool. Amen, brother.
History has vindicated the abolitionist, and the gradualists, like our founders, were on the wrong side of this story.
Wow. So, that makes me think, Craig. So, the faculty, trustees, they have terms. I mean, faculty, they're tenured, so they'll be around for their careers. And certainly you have great tenure on your board. But the seminarians, if they're full time, are probably rotating out, particularly Black seminaries, like every 3 years or so. And so I would imagine it's got to be difficult to maintain the trust of that group that may be graduating this year and next year, as the audit, it rightfully so, understandably has taken, 2 years to do. You're doing something that's going back 200 years, but then you've got this seminary that's graduating students, every year, and the people who were around when the audit started or when it came back or as the recommendations are being made are graduating. And so what's the process for keeping your past students of color, particularly African-American students, connected so that they don't feel like this is an approach that's using gradualism as well? How do you downplay that when you have a real process?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're working hard on that. I think there is some understandable suspicion or anxiety that will happen. Several of the recommendations that will be coming to the board call for the story to be woven into the curriculum and even into our orientation of new students, so that when you come here as a new student, you're getting to know what the seminary is about. The insights and the claims revealed in the audit will be a part of what new students get right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And then it will also be woven into the curriculum, so there'll be courses that are kind of including in this part of the story, so that we never lose sight of the lessons so we never lose sight of the lessons that the audit is trying to teach us about our story. One of the advantages of doing of this audit is it doesn't matter what your race is. If you're a part of Princeton Seminary, you have to claim this as our story.
Right.
So early on, when I came as president, I noticed we were struggling to make progress in our work on race relationships. We were struggling to make progress on our work with racial relationships because people were opting out of it by saying, that's not my story.
Sure.
And again, part of the awkwardness, I don't want to get involved with it because I'll say something wrong or I'll do something offensive.
Right.
So people were saying, well, you've got your story, but we've got our story, and our group has this story. Now, with the audit, one of the things that we've discovered through this year of conversations is everybody at Princeton Seminary has to claim that this is our story. It's not just their story, it's our story, because this is our family story. As you were saying, it's like when you do genealogical work and you find something in your family, you have to own this.
Right.
You have to confess that this is part of my family story.
Wow.
And so that's part of it. So as we tell Princeton's family story, this is part of what we have to tell.
Sure. This is fascinating on so many levels. I'm going to make sure that we have a link to the audit or whatever information about it that you'd like the public to know. I'll make sure we get that from your team so we can post that in the podcast. I'm curious if the discussion has piqued the curiosity of maybe council members or the mayor's office of Princeton, because not that they need to do an audit, but this certainly has had an impact on the growth and sustainability of it as a community. So have non-seminarians or non-seminary faculty and folks from the community shown interest in the audit or speaking into it or listening to it?
Yes. As the university has been doing this very publicly, and they released their audit a year before we did,
okay,
and now
all right.
we've done it, it's had an impact on the town of Princeton.
I would imagine
African Americans have been a part of this town since the 1700s, and so part of their work was at the university or at the seminary. So there is a side of this that is very much community oriented, particularly the African American churches here in town, and so some of those churches are led by alums of our seminary, and so the alumni have been involved with that. And there was a meeting last month at one of the African American churches called Witherspoon Presbyterian, which was a town hall meeting that was led by the pastor of that church, one of our alums, and our Association of Black Seminarians to discuss the report and ABS's own suggestions or petitions for how we should be responding to it.
Sure. Now, Witherspoon was one of the founders of the seminary or the university, right?
The university, right.
The university, right. You know what's really intriguing about this? Just a couple of other things, because I know your time is really valuable and I don't want to hold you too long. But I love the theological framework, Craig, because you mentioned that the report is a confession, but acting upon it is really restitution or reparations. And what I notice in the community where I live, I love it. We are known for creating reports ad nauseum that we have a number of reports on this, that, and the other thing, which is a confession, like this happened, but we have the reputation of not really moving on it. I feel that what Princeton is looking at doing, Princeton Seminary is looking to do, creates a theological framework that once we find out that a system is skewed, that it is worked to advantage one group over another group, just stating it is not enough. But what do you do to bring closure or healing? And so I feel that this kind of discussion with the theological framework could really help to raise the bar and deepen the discussions in the broader community, that it's not just enough to confess that these systems have been built. We're moving to do something about it because they're deeply rooted in the way we think, learn, worship, conduct ourselves, and we have to tie the history to the present. So I really appreciate the theological framework of confession, but it needing to move to some kind of action, because I think if we get more cities and communities and non-religious institutions thinking that way, I believe that we can move the needle. That in addition to meaningful relationships.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We've kept the language theological. One of the advantages of being a seminary doing this is we can use our own language.
Exactly.
But you can't just confess and say I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing.
Right.
So the confession leads to repentance. Other schools have used the word reparations, and we're not afraid of that word. We can even find theological language around that too, because if by reparations we mean to repair, that's a very theological concept.
Right.
To repair what has been broken.
Sure.
And so
that's powerful stuff.
I think there's some anxiety on the part of some that, well, we could never fully fix what we broke, and but we can begin the process of repair. We can turn towards the vision we have of a just kingdom of Christ for all people, and we can take concrete steps that can actually make a difference in people's lives.
That's very powerful. It's very powerful. Well, Dr. Barnes, I really do appreciate your time. You know, I'd love to go on and on and on, but I told you that I would try to keep things fairly concise so that I could ask the questions that I wanted to ask of you. But one, I just want to really to let you know that I respect and appreciate your leadership. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate about you during your stint or your time here in Madison is that I felt that you are a lifelong learner. And I couldn't expect you to fully understand everything I shared with you about my experiences, but I felt like you listened to them and that you've taken them to heart. And I've had enough conversations around the seminary campus when I was there to know that there's some real consternation around this and the process. But what I really have come to know about you and appreciate about you is the ability to really think deeply and to take bold steps and to really shepherd or govern this process as much as you can as the executive officer to make sure that this makes a very bold statement so that it calms the heart of African American people who are hoping that gradualism doesn't continue to happen, but something that sets a national, if not an international standard of what true reconciliation looks like, that it's not just singing Kumbaya and moving ahead. People don't want to look back because they feel like it'll get us stuck. But the audacity to think that looking back would really help the seminary and society and the church move forward, I think is a very bold move. So, friend, I appreciate your leadership, and my prayers and thoughts are with you. And I know that if anyone can help shepherd African-American folks, students, alum, through a process that will be that, you can't please everyone, but that will really make people say this is very thoughtful and this is moving us in the right direction. If anyone can do that at Princeton, I believe that you can.
Well, I appreciate it, Alex. But the conversations are not easy.
Right.
They're complicated.
Right.
We're speaking into years and years and years of institutional mistrust for deserved reasons. And so there's anxiety on all sides, but the conversation has to happen. And the direction, I think, is right, and the process is the best that we've been able to put together. that's kind of like what you and I were doing back in Madison 30 years ago. I mean, we were trying to work out of a relationship to prayerfully figure out what is right and what does the city need and how do we move there together. And there may be some missteps, but ultimately we think we'll get to the right place.
That's really important. And in the decision process, as a president, are you a part of the board at Princeton Seminary?
Well, I'm
ex officio?
I'm at the board meeting, so
at the board
I'll be with the task force as they present their recommendations.
That's what I was wondering about. All right, got you. So you'll be with them as they're presenting it to the board, and so I'll be.
The board's gonna need some time to sort through these recommendations. They're not gonna act on it immediately, but they will take these recommendations very, very seriously, I know, and they're going to do a deep dive into figuring out how do we redirect some of our directions and some of our finances of the seminary to respond to this report.
Wow. Well, I appreciate that. So again, friend, you're in my thoughts and my prayers, and I'm sure that I'll be checking with you, after, at the end of May or later on, just to kind of see how things went. But I appreciate your time today. I appreciate your friendship over the decades, and I'm excited about the fact that our paths continue to cross. So thank you for making time to be on Black Like Me today, and you have a great day, Craig.
You too, Alex. Thanks for the invitation to be part of your show. I appreciate it.
I want to thank Corey Saffold and Marcus Fleming for creating the music for this podcast, my podcast manager, Tyler Nyland, my engineer, Eli Steenledge, my editor, Jeremy Holliday, and our intro and outro are recorded by Cynthia Woodland. And a special thank you to WORT Studios, where we record Black Like Me.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.
Black like me.